to this lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video, we continue our examination of Plato's Phaedo, and we're going to begin to dive into the major arguments that he's going to give for the immortality of the soul. But before getting there, let's just recap a few of the major points that we hit last time. What we saw in the previous three videos on the Phaedo was Plato outlining this vision of what it means to do philosophy, what the ultimate goal of the philosopher is, and how this is related to death. So the ultimate goal of the philosopher is the attainment of truth. And also, as we saw, given Plato's theory of the forms, what it means to finally and ultimately attain the truth is to become acquainted with the perfect ideal essences of things, or to become acquainted with the perfect form of justice, the perfect form of beauty and friendship and circularity. That's what it means to truly gain knowledge. And as we said, Plato thought that these forms existed outside of space and time, right? We come across particular instances of circularity, particular instances of justice, but they're all imperfect. And if truly gaining knowledge means gaining knowledge of the perfect concept of those things, then we can never gain perfect knowledge in this life. And that's why Socrates tells us that he's actually welcoming, and he thinks any true philosopher should welcome his death, because upon his death, his soul will leave his body, and he will finally have the opportunity to become acquainted with the perfect forms and essences of things. He'll finally have the opportunity to gain true philosophical knowledge. Now, all that might sound great, but of course there's one important thing that's still missing at this point. And that is because although Socrates has given us many reasons for the true philosopher to hope that he will outlive his bodily death, he's given us many reasons to hope it's true that our soul is immortal, he's not actually yet provided any reason to think the soul is immortal. And it might just be the case that even if we accept that true philosophical knowledge cannot be found in this life, life might be tragic. It might be that the only way we could ever know perfect and final truths is if we come into contact with the forms. But it could also be the case that our soul dies when our body dies, that the soul is not immortal, and so we'll never be able to attain that knowledge. Life for the philosopher could simply be tragic. Unless, of course, Plato can give us some reasons to think that Socrates is right in his hopes. If Plato can give us some reason to think that Socrates is right, that the soul is immortal. And in fact, we see, just after it explains these points about why the philosopher should welcome his or her death, we see Cebes pushing Socrates on just this point. So he says, well, look, this is all fine and well, but in order to believe what you've said, we need to know that the soul is immortal. Because he says many people, they think that after it has left the body, after the soul has left the body, it no longer exists anywhere, but that it is destroyed and dissolved on the day the man dies. As soon as it leaves the body, and that on leaving it, it is dispersed like breath or smoke, has flown away and gone, and is no longer anything anywhere. So Cebes tells Socrates, says, look, many people believe that we have a soul, but think it just sort of, once our body dies, it just sort of evaporates, that it's no longer there, and so we can't survive our deaths. And specifically, he tells Socrates that there are really two things that he needs to show in order to convince them that Socrates will survive his own death. And he puts these points this way. So the first thing, he says, we need you to show us, Socrates, that the soul still exists after a man has died. And you might recall, this is one of the three major questions about surviving our death that I previously outlined. Specifically, this is the persistence question. Is it the case that when our body dies, our soul remains? Or is it the case that when our body dies, our soul dies as well? So one thing we'll need an answer to, Cebes says, is we'll need an answer to, how do we know the soul outlives the body? But there's a second question as well. He says, in order to find this convincing, not only do we need to know that the soul will survive or outlive the body, but we need to know, as Cebes says, that it, the soul, still possesses some capability and intelligence. So remember one of the things I told you last time. I said, even if you know that your soul will exist into an afterlife, that would bring you very little comfort if you didn't have any reason to think that soul is anything like you. right? If it didn't share any of your memories, or if that soul didn't share any of your desires or projects or any of the traits that make you who you are, then you might say a part of you has survived your death, but you haven't survived your death. And I call this the personal identity question. And I think Seebees is getting at this point here as well. He's saying, well, how do we, even if the soul does outlive us, how do we know it's still capable of intelligence? And this is important, of course, because if Socrates is right, given the theory of the forms we looked at last time, then to attain the philosopher's purpose, to attain true knowledge, you would need the ability to reason. It would not just be enough that your soul could outlive your body. That soul would need to be able to think and reason and understand, so that when it became acquainted with the forms, it would be able to understand the knowledge that it's gaining. So if we don't have any reason to think the soul has that intelligence, then once again, the philosopher's mission, the philosopher's purpose of attaining final and perfect knowledge would not be possible. So as we move through the rest of the Phaedo, you should keep these questions in mind. And we're going to see that Plato is largely going to be focusing on proving that the soul will outlast the body. But we should keep in mind, do his arguments also show that the soul would retain intelligence after the death of the body? Okay, now before we get into the specific arguments themselves, I just want to give you a basic outline of how the argumentative structure of the Phaedo is going to work. So what we're going to see is we're going to cover 3 different arguments that Plato has Socrates give in this dialogue. There's also a 4th at the very end of the dialogue, but we're not going to concern ourselves with that one. We're going to concern ourselves with the following 3 arguments. What I'm going to call the cyclical argument, the argument from recollection, and the affinity argument. And this video will just focus on the cyclical argument, but I want to give you a sense of how these work together. So the first thing that Plato wants to show is that he wants to show that the soul can exist apart from the body. Right? He wants to show that it is possible that our soul can have its own independent existence such that it doesn't need the body to live. And he's going to use 2 arguments to show that. He's going to use the cyclical argument and the argument from recollection. And as I said, we'll cover the cyclical argument in this video, and we will cover the argument from recollection in the next video. Okay, but let's say those 2 arguments together in tandem are successful. This means he would have shown that the soul can exist apart from the body, but then of course his work is not done, because just because the soul can exist apart or independent from the body doesn't mean the soul is immortal, doesn't mean the soul doesn't die. So he still needs a further argument. And here's where the affinity argument comes in. He's going to argue that based on what we know about the soul, based on what the soul is like, it's quite likely, or maybe even necessary, that the soul cannot die. And so this will get into his final conclusion, that the soul is immortal, it never comes out of existence. Okay, so this is how the 3 arguments work together, but like I said, in this video, we'll just look at the cyclical argument. Now what you're looking at here is the entire argument. I'm going to go through it step by step, but first I just want to make a few comments about the conclusion of the argument, and also why the argument has this title. This is a common title for this argument. So let's look at the very final conclusion of the argument. What Plato wants to show is that the soul must have existed independently prior to being associated with the body. So consider the moment of your birth, for instance. If Plato is right, then when you're born, or perhaps sometime prior to this, right, you could debate that question, but at some point, there is a point where your soul and your body become united. Okay, now, you could say, well, maybe that occurs because at some point in your development, your soul comes into existence and becomes united with your body, right? Your soul didn't exist before, but then it comes into existence, and now your soul and body are hanging out together. That could be one view. But Plato says, no, that's not what I want to show. I want to show that, yes, there is a point at which your soul and body become united. However, prior to that uniting, he wants to show that the soul existed already before that. He wants to show that your soul pre-exists your body. And the sort of inspiration that Plato takes for this is an ancient story or myth about the underworld that was popular at the time. So Plato says, let us examine it in some such manner as this: whether the souls of men who have died exist in the underworld or not. We recall an ancient theory that souls arriving there come from here, and then again when they arrive here are born here from the dead. If that is true, that the living come back from the dead, then surely our souls must exist there. For they cannot come back if they did not exist. And this is a sufficient proof that these things are so if it truly appears that the living never come from any source other than the dead. So there's this ancient myth that our souls now were previously in this underworld, and when we die, they'll return to the underworld. And recall also how Plato defines death. He defines death as the separation of the soul and the body, and he defines life as a state where those two things are united. Now, if that means if this myth is true, if our soul was previously in the underworld, now it's in this world, then when we die, it goes back to the underworld, then what we have is a certain sort of cycle, a cycle of life and death, where life gives way to death, and then death returns to life, and so on and so forth. So Plato isn't, although he sort of suggests in this passage, given that he has these arguments, he's not really taking the story itself to be enough proof to show that this is true, but he's taking inspiration from this story, and he wants to show that something like this is correct. But if you're going to show that something like that is correct, you first have to show that it's possible your soul could have existed somewhere else prior to when you were born, or prior to whenever your soul united with your body. And that's what he wants to show in this argument. Okay, so that's the final ultimate goal of the argument. Let's look at the premises. Let's see how Plato gets there. We're going to take this step by step. So let's take a look at premise 1. For any state that comes into being and has an opposite state, there must be a process whereby that state comes into being from its opposite state. And we're going to call this the oppositional generation principle. Now that might seem somewhat abstract, but the idea really isn't that difficult to understand. So take one of the examples that Plato talks about, right? The state of being swift or fast. Okay, so you can imagine, right, there was a point in your life when, you might say, well, I'm not fast now. But let's say you are someone who's fast, you can run very fast now. Well, there had to be some point in your life in which you weren't fast, right? So there had to be a point in life, even if it was, when you're very young, when you're a baby, right? At some point you're crawling around, you can hardly move. No one would say you were fast then. But then, of course, you developed the ability to crawl and the ability to walk and the ability to run. And then once you were able to run, you were able to train yourself, and you worked over time to become fast. So notice, the state of being fast comes into being. You weren't always fast, but you are now. And where did that state come from? Well, it came from its opposite state. It came from the state of being slow. And that's all the first claim is making. Any state, any condition you're in that comes into existence must come into existence from its opposite. And let's look at some of the examples that Plato gives here. He says, for all things which come to be, let us see whether they come to be in this way, that is, from their opposites, if they have such. As the beautiful is the opposite of the ugly, and the just of the unjust, and 1,000 other things of the kind. So notice it's not just things like he uses larger and smaller, swift and slow, strong and weak. Those are more obvious, but even something like beauty. So imagine you have a beautiful painting. Okay, well, where did the beauty of the painting come from? Now, you might quibble with the word ugly, because you might say, well, the painting came from all the parts sort of not united, right? So you might have an empty canvas, and you might have the paint cans and the paint brushes and the idea in your mind of what the painting will look like. And you might not call that ugly. Maybe that's sort of the wrong word, but it's certainly not beautiful, right? An empty canvas with just all the sort of basic components of the painting is not yet beautiful, and it had to come from its opposite state of not being beautiful, of not being aesthetically pleasing. Or if you think about your ability to create beautiful paintings, then once again, just like the ability to run fast, that had to be trained in you, right? There was a point in your life when you couldn't create beautiful paintings, and now you can. Or think of justice and injustice and apply it to a society. So if you see an extremely just form of human organization, then you might say, well, it seems reasonable to say that must have come from an unjust one. And likewise, you might say if you see an unjust type of human organization, it might be very likely that it deteriorated from a just form of human organization. So his basic point is that whenever some state comes into being, it must have come into being from its opposite state. And we're going to call that the oppositional generation principle. Okay, so that's the first premise. Now you might say, well, what does that have to do? What does that have to do with our current topic of life and death? Well, Plato addresses that in the second premise. So P2, the state of being dead is the opposite of the state of being alive. And given the way that Plato has defined what it means to be dead, this seems to be true. Remember, to be dead is to have your soul separated from your body. To be alive is to have them united. So, that would certainly seem to be the opposite. In the one case, there are two things that are separated. In the other case, there are two things that are together and that are mingling. So those do seem to be opposite states. And to this, he adds and one way to think about this is, Plato says, well, is there an opposite to living, as sleeping is the opposite of being awake? What is it? Being dead. And of course, his example of sleeping and being awake is instructive because, as we said before, there really is an eerie resemblance between being dead and being asleep. But in this case, you can see that based on how he defines these terms, the state of life where your soul and body are together would be the opposite of the state of death where your soul and body are separated. Okay, so you can sort of see where he's going here. P1 said that any state which comes into existence must come from its opposite, and the opposite of life is death. Okay, so we're going to get to the third premise in a second, but just think about those two claims alone, and you can sort of see where Plato is going here. If death is the opposite of life, and if all states which come into being come from their opposites, then where did the state of life come from? Well, if death is the opposite of life, and you didn't used to be alive and now you are, then life would have had to come from death. Just as being swift came from being slow, just as being strong came from being weak, just as being beautiful came from being ugly. And now think about for a second what that would mean. For the state of life to come from the state of death, it would have to be the case that there was a time when your soul existed apart from your body. Because remember, to be alive, right? To be alive is to have your soul and body united. To be apart is to have them separate. So that previous state which life came from, the state that Plato was calling death, had to be a situation in which the soul was existing by itself. And you'll remember, that is exactly the claim that Plato wants to make. But of course, you might say at this point, well, wait a minute. I mean, I can see where Plato is going, but just because a state comes from its opposite doesn't mean it needs to happen in both directions. For example, why couldn't it just be the case that life comes from death, but death does not come from life? Why does it need to be the case that it happens in both directions, life coming from death and death coming from life? So this is a question that, of course, Plato needs to give us an answer to. And in fact, as I've outlined in the third premise of the argument, he explicitly argues that this idea of opposites coming from one another cannot occur only in one direction. So P3, the process whereby a state comes into being from its opposite state cannot occur only in one direction. Let's see how he explains this. I think Socrates, he said, that this follows from what we have agreed on. Consider in this way, Cebes, he said, that as I think, we were not wrong to agree. If the two processes of becoming did not always balance each other as if they were going round in a circle, but generation proceeded from one point to its opposite in a straight line, and did not turn back again to the other opposite or take any turning, do you realize that all things would ultimately be in the same state? be affected in the same way and cease to become. So what is he saying here? He says, if all changed from opposites only and went in one direction, so if all ugly things only became beautiful, but not the other way around, if all unjust things only became just and not the other way around, if all slow things only became fast and not the other way around, then where would we ultimately end up? Well, he says everything would be in the same condition. And everything would be just, everything would be beautiful, everything would be fast, everything would be strong. But that's not the case. We can look around and see many ugly things, we can see many injustices, we can see many people who are weak and slow. And so that can't be the case. Now, one of the examples he uses to show this is with going to sleep. So imagine it were the case, so we said being awake and being asleep are opposites. Imagine being awake came from being asleep, but being asleep didn't come from being awake. Or actually, the way he puts it, imagine being asleep came from being awake, but not the other way around. Well, then eventually everyone would be asleep. If the state of being awake led to the state of being asleep, but sleep never came back around to being awake, then the entire world would simply be asleep. If change only occurred from ugly to beautiful, then everything would be beautiful. The basic point is when you have these opposites that change into each other, it cannot only happen in one direction. Because if it only happened in one direction, then everything would be the same. So how does this make his point? So the first conclusion of the argument is the following. So this means if we have these opposites, they change into each other, and it cannot happen in one direction, then not only is there a process whereby being dead comes from being alive, because that's obvious. Everyone accepts that there are people who are alive, and someday they'll be dead. But it can't just go in one direction. So not only does being dead come from being alive, but also being alive comes from being dead. Because if it was not the case that being alive came from being dead, then simply everyone would be dead. If there was no regeneration, then eventually everything would be death. Everything would be in the same state. And so, again, what does this mean? Well, if there is a state from which being alive comes from the state of being dead, then that means the current state you're in, where your soul is united with your body, must have come from a point where your soul and your body were separate. And if there was a point at which your soul and body were separate, your soul must be able to exist all by itself without your body. And this is exactly the point he makes in what I'm calling premise 4. If there is a process whereby the state of being alive comes from the state of being dead, then the soul must have existed independently prior to being associated with the body. And here's how Plato explains this. Then see these living creatures and things come to be from the dead? Well, then that must mean our souls exist in the underworld. So if our current condition of being alive came from being dead, then that must be there was a time in what he calls the underworld where our souls existed by themselves. And he continues on, it is agreed between us then that the living come from the dead in this way, no less than the dead come from the living. And if that is so, it seems to be a sufficient proof that the souls of the dead must be somewhere whence they can come back again. Coming to life again in truth exists, the living come to be from the dead, and the souls of the dead exist. So now we can see that Plato's getting somewhere. If that argument is sound, then we have good reason to at least think that the soul is separate, can live without the body. And that by itself doesn't show the soul is immortal, but it shows it's at least possible, if he's right, that when your body dies, your soul could still hang out by itself. And the reason we know your soul could hang out by itself is because it's done it before. Namely, before you were born or before you came to exist. Right? And so here's what he thinks, in another way to put it, here's what he thinks he's shown. Right now, you have the state of life. After birth, your soul and your body united. There must have been some prior state where just your soul existed. Okay, so this is the basic argument, and I'll certainly be interested to hear what your thoughts on this argument are, as it's extremely important for understanding the Phaedo. And I'll just sort of throw out a couple questions you might want to think about when evaluating this argument. So, one thing you might want to look at is P1. Plato assumes that whenever you have a or really this is sort of the point made in P1 and P3, whenever you have two opposites, he assumes those opposites must come from one another, right? Being strong comes from being weak comes from being strong, right? You strengthen yourself over time, and then you become weak through deterioration. And he assumes that all pairs of opposites are like that. So we might ask ourselves the question, is this actually true? Are there any pairs of opposites in which change only occurs in one direction? Or even if it can occur in both directions, is it at least possible that sometimes it doesn't? So that would be one question. Can we think of any counterexamples to this claim that change always occurs in both directions from opposites? Because if there are counterexamples, then maybe life and death are one of those. Maybe it's the case that death always comes from life, but life never came from a situation in which we were dead, namely, in which our soul didn't have a body attached to it. We might also think about, and so that's a question really about P1 and P3, we might also think about P2. The state of being dead is the opposite of the state of being alive. Given how Plato has defined life and death, it's easy to say that life and death are opposites, but given the specific way in which he has defined these terms, death being the separation of the soul and the body, life being the uniting of these two things, given that, is it actually the case that those are opposites? Or might there be some other opposite of being alive? In any case, I'll be interested to hear what you think. I hope that video was useful, and I will see you next time.